Imagine if the United States suddenly sold Texas for a few $1 million, a territory rich in resources, strategically important, and potentially worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It sounds impossible. Yet in 1867, Russia did something surprisingly similar. They sold Alaska to the United States for just $7.2 million. Today, Alaska contains vast reserves of oil, natural gas, gold, and one of the most strategically important military positions on Earth. So why did Russia give it away? And did they make one of the biggest mistakes in history? A land that was never supposed to be American. When most people think of Alaska today, they think of an American state, a land of towering mountains, glaciers, wildlife, and endless wilderness. But for more than a century, Alaska belonged to Russia. Russia first arrived in Alaska during the 1700s. At the time, explorers weren't searching for gold or oil. They were searching for fur, especially sea otter fur. In the 18th century, sea otter fur was one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Demand was exploding across Europe and Asia, and Alaska had plenty of it. Russian traders quickly established settlements and trading posts along the coast. For a while, the colony seemed like a success. Trade expanded, profits grew, and Russia strengthened its presence in North America. But beneath the surface, a major problem was beginning to emerge. The problem wasn't that Alaska lacked value. The problem was that Alaska was simply too far away. The colony Russia could barely control. To understand Russia's dilemma, look at a map. Alaska sat thousands of miles away from Russia's major cities. Every shipment had to cross dangerous waters. Communication was painfully slow. And defending the territory was incredibly difficult. If another nation attacked Alaska, Russia would struggle to respond in time. At the same time, the fur trade was beginning to decline. Sea otter populations had been heavily hunted. The resource that once made Alaska profitable was slowly disappearing. Suddenly, Alaska was becoming more expensive to maintain than the profits it generated. What had once looked like an opportunity was starting to look like a burden. But Russia's biggest concern wasn't distance, and it wasn't money. It was another empire, one that already controlled the territory right next door, the British threat. In the mid-1800s, the British Empire controlled Canada, and Canada shared a border with Alaska. Russia's fears became even greater after the Crimean War. The war damaged Russia's economy and exposed weaknesses in its military. Russian leaders knew a simple but terrifying fact. If another conflict broke out with Britain, Alaska would be almost impossible to defend. And if Britain decided to seize the territory, Russia would lose everything, without compensation, without negotiation, without a deal. From Russia's perspective, selling Alaska suddenly looked far safer than trying to keep it. But there was one question left. Who would buy it? Russia wasn't looking for the highest bidder. They were looking for the safest buyer. And there was only one country that made sense: the United States. America's unexpected opportunity. At the time, America was expanding rapidly. Many leaders believed the country's future depended on growth and expansion. One of those leaders was Secretary of State William Seward. Unlike many of his critics, Seward saw potential where others saw ice and wilderness. He believed Alaska could become a valuable strategic asset, a gateway to Asia, a military advantage in the North Pacific, and possibly a source of future wealth. When Russia quietly offered to sell Alaska, Seward immediately became interested. Negotiations moved quickly, and on March 30th, 1867, the deal was finalized. The United States purchased Alaska for $7.2 million, more than $580 86,000 square miles of territory for roughly 2 cents per acre. Today, that sounds like an incredible bargain, but in 1867, many Americans thought it was a terrible mistake. Seward's Folly. The public reaction was brutal. Newspapers mocked the purchase, politicians criticized it, and ordinary Americans questioned why millions had been spent on what appeared to be a frozen wasteland. Critics gave the deal a nickname, Seward's Folly. Others called it Seward's Icebox. To many people, Alaska looked completely worthless. There were no major cities, no obvious riches, and no clear reason for America to own it. For years, it seemed as if the critics might be right. Then everything changed. Gold changes. Everything. In the late 1800s, gold was discovered in Alaska. Suddenly, the territory that nobody wanted became the center of attention. News spread rapidly. Thousands of prospectors rushed north, hoping to strike it rich. Entire communities were transformed. Alaska was no longer seen as a frozen wasteland. It had become a land of opportunity. But gold was only the beginning, because beneath Alaska's frozen landscape lay something even more valuable. The treasure beneath the ice. Over the following decades, geologists discovered enormous reserves of oil and natural gas. The territory that critics had laughed at was sitting on one of the most valuable collections of natural resources in North America. Those resources would eventually generate hundreds of billions of dollars. What once looked worthless had become one of America's most resource-rich territories. Yet Alaska's greatest value wasn't gold, and it wasn't oil. Its greatest value came from a global conflict that nobody in 1867 could have predicted: the Cold War advantage. After World War II, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to rise. The Cold War had begun, and suddenly, Alaska became one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. Look at a globe. Russia and Alaska are surprisingly close. In some places, only a few miles separate them. That made Alaska a critical location for military bases, surveillance operations, radar systems, and national defense. What Russia once considered a distant burden had become a frontline asset for the United States. The purchase that Americans had once mocked now looked like a masterstroke, and people began asking a different question: not whether America had overpaid, but whether Russia had made one of the greatest mistakes in history. Looking back today, it's easy to call the Alaska purchase one of the greatest land deals ever made. For just $7.2 million, the United States acquired a territory rich in resources and unmatched in strategic value. But history is rarely that simple. When Russia sold Alaska in 1867, they weren't trying to give away a fortune. They were trying to solve a problem that seemed very real at the time. No one knew about the massive oil reserves. No one could predict the Cold War. And nobody imagined how important Alaska would eventually become. More than 150 years later, historians still debate the decision. Was selling Alaska a costly mistake? Or was it the smartest option Russia had at the time? If you had been standing in 1867 with the same information available then, what would you have done? Would you have sold Alaska? Or would you have kept it? Because sometimes the decisions that look obvious today were anything but obvious when history was being written. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more hidden stories from history, subscribe to Decoded History and tell us in the comments, if you were standing in 1867, would you have sold Alaska? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.